An order that was never written. No document recorded it. No signature approved it. And yet, everyone inside the White House understood exactly what was expected. An order had been given 97 without ever being written down. This is how power often moves at its most refined level, not through formal commands, but through implication, through tone, through what is emphasized and what is quietly avoided. In environments where authority is absolute and consequences are permanent, the absence of words can be more instructive than any directive. This matters today because modern leadership rarely relies on explicit instruction alone. Inside the White House, written orders create records. Records create accountability, and accountability creates risk. So when an outcome is desired without the weight of formal ownership, influence takes a different form. The situation began during a moment of sustained pressure. Decisions were sensitive. Public scrutiny was intense. Any official action would trigger debate, resistance, or legal consequence. The president understood this. So did the advisors. And so the guidance came indirectly. It started with emphasis. Certain priorities were mentioned repeatedly. Others stopped appearing in briefings. Questions that once invited discussion were no longer raised. Meetings were scheduled in ways that narrowed participation. Nothing explicit changed. Everything practical did. Staff noticed quickly. In the White House, people are trained to read between lines. When a president asks about one option and not another, it signals preference. When silence follows suggestion, it signals disapproval. Over time, these signals form a pattern, and that pattern becomes instruction. No one could point to a moment when an order was given, because it never was. Instead, it emerged through alignment, through shared understanding of risk, through anticipation of consequence. Acting differently would not be forbidden 97, but it would be noticed. This is how unwritten orders gain power. They preserve deniability while shaping behavior. They allow leadership to influence outcomes without creating artifacts that can be challenged later. And they rely on something stronger than rules. They rely on expectation. By the time action followed, it felt natural, even inevitable. Teams moved in the same direction, without coordination. Decisions aligned without discussion. The outcome unfolded as if guided by a central directive, 97, yet no directive existed. The order that was never written had done its work. And once it had, the White House would face a difficult question. When power operates without records, where does responsibility truly reside? Once the unwritten order took hold, the system adjusted around it. Departments aligned their actions without needing confirmation. Legal teams interpreted silence as boundary. Communications teams shaped language to fit what was now understood rather than what was explicitly stated. Coordination happened not through meetings, but through instinct. What made this dynamic so effective was its plausibility. No one could be accused of following an order that did not exist. Every action could be defended as individual judgment. And yet, those judgments converged with remarkable consistency. The unwritten order had become a shared operating principle. Inside the White House, this was not seen as manipulation. It was seen as efficiency. Formal directives slow things down. They invite debate. They create records that demand justification. An unwritten order bypasses all of that. It allows momentum without ownership. But momentum without ownership carries risk. When something goes wrong, tracing responsibility becomes nearly impossible. Each participant can point to reasonable interpretation. Each decision appears defensible in isolation. The collective outcome, however, tells a different story. Advisors began to notice the narrowing effect. Alternatives stopped surfacing. Questions that might challenge direction were quietly avoided, not because they were forbidden, but because they were understood to be unwelcome. The system had internalized expectation so thoroughly that correction now felt disruptive. The president felt the benefit immediately. Fewer conflicts, faster execution, less visible resistance. Leadership appeared decisive without issuing commands. But beneath that smooth surface, accountability was dissolving. Power was being exercised without trace. This is the hidden tension of unwritten orders. They solve problems in the short term by removing friction. In the long term, They weaken institutions by removing clarity. When no one owns the instruction, no one can fully own the outcome. The White House now stood in a familiar position, enjoying the efficiency of implication while sensing the danger of ambiguity. The order had never been written in 97, but it was now everywhere. And the longer it operated unchecked, the harder it would be to reverse without exposure. Because once expectations replace directives, power becomes harder to see and harder to hold accountable. The conflicts surfaced when consequences began to emerge without a clear point of origin. A decision produced backlash. A response triggered scrutiny. And when questions were asked, there was no document to reference, no directive to explain, only a pattern of behavior that pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Advisors felt the tension immediately. They had acted in good faith, guided by what they believed leadership wanted. But now, they were being asked to defend actions that no one had officially authorized. The unwritten order had protected leadership from Record 97, but it had also left execution exposed. Inside the White House, this created unease. Not panic, but discomfort. The system had moved efficiently, but it had also blurred responsibility. When accountability is diffuse, trust erodes internally. People begin to hesitate, not knowing whether future actions will be supported or disowned. The president recognized the danger. Influence without documentation offers flexibility, but also removes the guardrails that protect institutions. Without clear directives, interpretation replaces instruction. And interpretation, once embedded, is difficult to unwind without revealing how power truly moved. The conflict reached its peak when a critical moment demanded clarity. A decision could no longer be guided by implication. It required ownership, but acknowledging the unwritten order meant admitting that governance had occurred outside formal process. Denying it meant allowing confusion to harden into precedent. Silence filled the room as leadership weighed the trade-off. Preserve deniability or restore structure, maintain flexibility or reassert accountability. The unwritten order had delivered results in 97, but it had also hollowed out clarity. This was not a crisis of legality. It was a crisis of governance, the kind that emerges when systems rely too heavily on understanding instead of instruction, on expectation instead of authorization. The White House now faced a defining choice. Continue operating in shadows that felt efficient but fragile, or bring the order into the open, knowing that doing so would slow everything down. The conflict was no longer about a single outcome. It was about whether power could continue operating without a Record 97, and what that meant for leadership itself. Decisions made outside the room. The most important decision was never discussed in the meeting where everyone was present. By the time the doors closed and the conversation officially began, the outcome was already leaning in one direction. This matters because power inside the White House does not always operate where the microphones are. Some decisions are shaped long before the room fills. In hallways, in private conversations, in moments that leave no transcript and no record of consensus. The Oval Office is often portrayed as the center of decision-making, but in reality, it is the final stop in a much longer process. By the time an issue reaches that room, assumptions have already hardened, options have been filtered, urgency has been assigned. The debate begins late in the story. This dynamic begins with preparation. Briefings are written, talking points are refined, participants are chosen carefully. Each step narrows possibility. Each step removes friction. What appears to be an open discussion is often the end of a negotiation that happened elsewhere. Advisors understand this instinctively. Influence is strongest before positions are public, before arguments must be defended. A quiet conversation can redirect an issue more effectively than an hour-long meeting ever could. And once that redirection happens, reversing it becomes difficult. The president may sense this without fully naming it. A decision feels natural, logical, supported, but that sense of inevitability did not come from the room itself. It came from everything that happened before it. At first, this seems efficient. Meetings are shorter. Consensus appears faster. Conflict feels resolved. But efficiency achieved this way hides something important. When decisions are made outside the room, accountability becomes harder to trace. Debate becomes symbolic rather than substantive. This story begins at that moment of realization. The moment leadership recognizes that the most consequential choices may no longer be happening where they are supposed to. Because when decisions are made before discussion begins, the room stops being a place of judgment. It becomes a place of confirmation. Once decisions begin forming outside the room, the meeting itself changes character. Questions are asked, but their answers feel predetermined. Alternatives are mentioned, but quickly dismissed. What looks like deliberation functions more like alignment. Inside the White House, this shift is subtle but powerful. Participants arrive already sensing which direction the conversation will go. Some reinforce it. Others test it gently, reading reactions before pushing further. Few challenge it directly. The room has already moved. This dynamic thrives on preparation. Pre-meetings shape expectation. One-on-one conversations set tone. By the time the full group convenes, momentum has weight. Reversing it would require visible resistance, and visible resistance carries cost. The president may not realize how much has been decided in advance. From their perspective, the meeting feels orderly, focused, free of chaos. That order is appealing, but it can also mask the loss of genuine choice. Advisors who disagree face a dilemma: speak up in a room and risk being isolated, or adapt and influence from the margins. Over time, many choose the latter. Debate migrates outward. The real discussion happens earlier, quieter, and among fewer people. This creates a feedback loop. The more decisions are shaped before the room, the less the room matters. And the less it matters, the more influence shifts to informal spaces. Authority remains formal. Power becomes informal. The danger is not secrecy. It is compression. When complex decisions are compressed into informal consensus, nuance is lost. Assumptions go untested. Minority views fade. The system becomes faster, 97 but thinner. The White House now faces a familiar tension: efficiency versus depth, predictability versus surprise, meetings that feel decisive versus meetings that actually decide. The conflict was not about process for its own sake. It was about whether leadership still had access to genuine disagreement before committing the nation to a path. Because when decisions are made outside the room itself stops protecting against error. And error, when unchallenged, compounds quietly. The conflict reached its peak when a decision made this way produced consequences no one in the room could fully explain. On paper, the meeting had gone smoothly. Consensus had been visible. Objections had been minimal. And yet, the outcome exposed assumptions that had never been debated openly. Advisors retraced the process and found the truth uncomfortably clear. The real deliberation had happened elsewhere, in side conversations, in informal agreements, in moments when not everyone was present. By the time concerns surfaced publicly, momentum had already carried the decision forward. The president felt the weight of this realization. Leadership had not failed because of poor judgment, but because judgment had been exercised too early, too narrowly, and without sufficient challenge. The room had confirmed a path rather than tested it. This was the emotional turning point. Not frustration, but recognition. Recognition that the system designed to protect against collective error had been bypassed by convenience. That efficiency had displaced scrutiny. That agreement had replaced examination. Some advisors defended the process, arguing that informal consensus was unavoidable in fast-moving environments. Others warned that the cost of speed was growing. Both were right, but the balance had tipped too far toward decisions made quietly, before leadership could feel the full weight of trade-offs. An